this is hardcore. I mean, this is hardcore. It's a totally different level, and you're actually facing mortal danger. You know, you can get a missile in your head anytime.
Well, thanks a lot for doing this. First of all, it's obviously difficult circumstances for you, and don't worry about the grainy quality of the video. So it records it in a nice like quality, but it'll only show you in kind of the lesser one so that it keeps the bandwidth down.
Yep.
And apologies, I've been kind of fighting the cold the past week, so I hope you can still understand me and everything's all right. But how's everything where you are?
Well, I'm in my mother-in-law's place now since 2 weeks basically, and we figured her apartment was safer than ours. It's further down in the building she lives. Her apartment is further down, and the building is also located in a way that we thought it would be a safer place, and we didn't want to leave her alone, basically. My father-in-law,
And that's in
sorry,
no, that's in Kyiv, correct?
that's in
Still in
Kyiv, yeah,
Kyiv?
yeah. And my father-in-law, he's retired, so he's spending a lot of time in the home where he grew up in a village, which is sort of our, summer place, summer house, or what we should call it. And it's like 100 or 120 kilometers from here. And he was there when the whole drama started, and he's sort of stuck out there now.
Oh
But
no.
we figure it's a pretty safe place to be, actually. And
Okay.
yeah, he can't go here though. That's not safe. That's for sure, because he's like,
Right.
he's on the edge of what is now the war zone. So it's all turbulence in between his place and our place. It's not, maybe not even possible to go. He might be blocked by the Ukrainian military, saying like, no, sorry, nobody gets through here. The road. I mean, I went. I was outside just before going on this call for a while, and in the neighborhood, and there are roadblocks everywhere now, basically. I mean, everywhere. It's seriously. They are. I think anyway. I will not go into details how they operate, but let's say the city is preparing for defense. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And
No,
we are
sure. I
really
mean, feel
being.
free to tell me. Yeah, sorry, I think we have a bit of a delay, but I was just gonna say, feel free to tell me anything that obviously you don't want to compromise any security stuff, but because what we see on the news is basically that you have a lot of people. It doesn't matter who you are. If you're seen on the street, they stop you in certain places because there's a lot of they're calling them saboteurs and stuff like that. People who could be out and bombing things. So what is it like? Because I know you've been posting on Twitter about going into the city. You took a cab ride yesterday. What is it like in the city right now?
Well, obviously, it's very quiet. This is a very hectic city. The traffic jams in Kyiv are one of the worst in Europe. It's really a hassle to get through here. And if you're small, and there are traffic accidents all the time, pretty much the kind of, the bumper things, fender benders.
Yeah, yeah.
But they block traffic for a while, and traffic is screwed. And typically what could take you 10 minutes will take you an hour. And now it's empty, of course. And the other day when I did go out for a ride, there were plenty of barricades to pass and checkpoints that I can say. We got our ID checked once and our luggage searched once. So we weren't stopped at every place, but and locally here, I have not been stopped when I'm out and about. And but today, for example, I avoid going through the manned checkpoints because because I can't, but because I don't want to add some extra time with the guys. When I can go another route, I go another route. And obviously,
Right.
never use the camera, or even to try to stay away from the phone in general, because of course, obviously, the guys again, you don't want to create an unnecessary hassle, and obviously they will take your phone with no questions asked if they see you use it, and that's it. And then they probably arrest you as well, which
Right.
I have all
You're
respect for.
also
I totally
posting,
understand this. We're in a war
right? No,
zone. The armed forces should have the rights to they shouldn't have to debate with the civilians about these things.
no, it's yeah, let's ask questions later because yeah, now's not the time or the place for that. It's and I mean, it's difficult for them as well because there are still civilians in Kyiv, people trying to, survive. They've been showing, footage on the news of people in the bunkers and, underground and the metro stations and places like that. And obviously the military is just trying to, do the best that they can, but it makes it extra difficult the way that the Russians clearly don't care about civilians, so I
No,
think that has to make it even more difficult to defend them.
well, I mean, I would almost add that the Russians uh, not only don't care, they purposely target civilians. It's part of their warfare tactics to suppress
Right.
morale and to create an extra burden for the defender, who have to then spend resources on taking care of civilians. So
Right.
it's the worst, most ruthless form of warfare.
Yeah.
Because, for example, the evacuations of Irpin and Mariupol in specifically, where the defenders, the Ukrainians, cleared then mines and obstacles for the civilians to get out. They basically, Russians saw it as them clearing a route for them to get in.
Right.
So, you know, it's they don't play by any rules. They never did. They never did. It's just that the West never defended itself against the Russians. They never played by any. They didn't. They're basically like criminals who just basically have a cost benefit analysis, right? And if they can get away with something, they will just do it anyway. They are like yeah, basically, if you don't have a burglar alarm, they will steal from you. If they think the cops will come, they might not steal from you. It's not about the stealing. They don't give a shit about the stealing or killing. There's no concern. It's just about how much it will cost them to do this. They have no
Yep.
rules, and they have no morale and no morality. That's just what it is. Yeah.
Right. No, totally true. Um, what's the feeling like of people there? What are people saying and talking about when it comes to because obviously it's changed over the past 2 weeks. Like you say, you probably had some form of expectation even when the invasion started of a certain code of conduct that they would have or certain levels of just even following the Geneva Convention. And now the way that things have become, now they're describing it as barbaric and horrific and things like that. What are people saying there? What's the feeling?
No, nobody had any different expectations than what we see. People have lived with war here for 8 years. We are all familiar with the Russians' tactics in Donbass, the occupied territories. So we had no
Yep.
expectations different. People have been following the war in Syria, have seen how Russia conduct warfare. People in Ukraine are well familiar with the Russian campaigns in Chechnya in the 90s and around the millennium, and there's no difference there. So with that regard, people are not surprised. I'm not surprised about the Ukrainian conduct either. I know a lot of people are. I know a lot of Westerners and media or analysts are surprised by Ukrainians standing up and how they civilians and military conducting themselves. My mother-in-law is also surprised about the civilians, how they conduct themselves. She keeps mentioning this. She lived in this neighborhood now for 35 years, and I think she lived in Kyiv for almost 45 years. And she mentions how people are polite and well behaved and calm. Those things she mentioned every time we go out together. We don't go out, of course, very often, but usually I follow her to the
Right.
store, which is 10-minute walk from here, and which is a bit of a hassle to now too, because it's like long lines and it's getting emptied out, and the randomness in terms of products now. A couple of days there was no bread, and then I think they managed some system, and all of a sudden we had plenty of bread, but only one kind. And today there were a different selection, so it comes and goes. But dairy products are completely wiped, though. Milk, you can forget about milk, for example.
So you're kind of, lacking on the perishable goods, like stuff that expires is probably difficult to get replaced.
Yeah, and it will obviously also, I think we're going towards a situation where some non-perishable goods that are of less importance will also fade away. There will not be a priority to fill up the, with candy and chips or whatever. There will be less priority, so those goods will go away, and the focus will be on those basic staple goods, I think. Water is a problem.
Provide a bit. No, go ahead.
Water is a problem here because the tap water is not considered clean. So people drink water from bottle, and it's hard to get bottled water right now.
Yeah, they said there were some kids, the students, who were, trying to drink, like they were taking snow and then thawing it and trying to drink that because they couldn't get any water in some places. And obviously that's terrible for you. I just wanted to provide some context to people because so you've spoken a bit about your mother-in-law and your father-in-law, and you've talked about Ukrainians, in the third person. So you are Swedish. We've known each other for a few months, actually. Never actually had a conversation before, and
No.
so I actually saw you on Twitter the day that the invasion happened, and I recognized your face, I recognized your name, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I thought I saw you had like maybe 50,000 followers on Twitter or something on that day, and now it's like up to 160,000 because you've just been tweeting all the news and letting people know kind of everything that's going on. And I think now I see people from CNN who I've seen on CNN and now following you on Twitter to go to you to, kind of see the firsthand accounts. But so when you say that people weren't, that people have been talking about all over, if they're so surprised that the Ukrainians have been so strong and fought so bravely, they're surprised that they fought back the invasion. And you say, that you're not surprised, and most Ukrainians also aren't surprised by that.
Well, I think most Ukrainians are not surprised that Ukrainians fight back. I think that people are not surprised about. And I think Ukrainians are generally underestimated as a nation, straight through. And we've seen that, it's going to take Russia 2 days. It's going to be like boom, boom, in and out, surgical operation, and Ukrainians will be rolled over. And also a lot of people expected Ukrainians to fold, not only lose the battle, but basically give up. And my experience from Euromaidan, where I went to the square downtown Kyiv every day almost during those 3 months, and I was there every single day. The last week, that was the most brutal week. I wasn't there when the actual shootings happened on that Thursday. I was on my way though. But there was some violence outside my house. I lived very close to Maidan during that period. And there was some violence outside my house, so I held off for a while. And then the shooting started, and I decided not to go. But I was shot at a couple of days before when the violence started on that Tuesday. And I saw how people acted. And here's the thing. I saw how people reacted and acted and conducted themselves on Maidan. And I knew that if Ukrainians get pushed like that, there is an enormous outpour of energy, ingenuity, what's the word? It's a good word. Resourcefulness, I think it is in English, right? That, they act on the situation and create solutions as they go. And I saw a lot of that. Bravery, willing to sacrifice, all those things I saw. And I predicted correctly, as I see now. I also said, though, that the invasion will never happen. I went live on Swedish national radio talking about it just before.
Said that.
Yeah, it will not happen. It's just too stupid, I said. And I've been wrong about Russia many times because it's just too weird. But Ukrainians are now showing exactly what I expected them to show, an enormous ferocity in defense. And for me, it's obvious that Russia will not succeed with the war and they will not win. It's also obvious that they will not succeed in capturing Kyiv. And they've been going at it now since I think the first, it almost started immediately. I don't remember now exactly if it was the first or the second day they made those landings, helicopter landings just northwest of Kyiv. And then later they actually tried to get in. They were actually fighting very close to here, but I slept. I slept through it. Uh, just like I sleep through some air raid alarms now. Only in the morning when I wake up, I'm like, oh, missed a couple. You're getting
It's like
used to
white
that too.
noise now for you.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like it's weird. It's
So
weird how
tell.
it happens. You get used to this stuff. Really weird.
Mhm. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. So, because there are some, I think, some parallels to COVID in the sense that, so when COVID first happened, you had kind of this early period when it was only in China, maybe back in, December 2019, and we didn't really know much about it yet. It hadn't really, sunk into people. And I remember reading the news articles the week before the invasion happened of, Ukrainians are going about their normal lives. They're brushing off, news of a potential invasion. Biden was going on TV basically every day saying, we believe, an invasion is imminent. And I remember I have a Russian colleague and I was speaking with her, talking about, mentioning what Biden had said. And she's like, oh, yeah, they keep saying this, but I don't think it's going to happen. And then, so you kind of have that, week long period before the, invasion actually happens. And obviously, many people were in shock that they actually invaded. What was the feeling like in that week, build up before the day they actually invaded? What was kind of the mood of, like you said, of people disbelief? People just didn't want to think it was possible. What was the feeling?
You know, zero reaction. It wasn't like COVID actually. Even if it's a good example, it wasn't like it started. It might come here. No, it was like it never started. It was like no, it's not going on. Basically, there was
Hmm.
no real preparations visible among regular people. I stocked up a little bit because I read some foreigners here started to do their prepping a little bit, but now obviously I regret it that I didn't stock up more. Now has been possible though to stock up. So now in this house we probably managed for 2 weeks or something at least without leaving the place. We got plenty of water, we got plenty of food, we got a lot of energy food that you can eat without preparation. But I was like, I'm not a young man anymore, so I wake up at night and I wake up, I maybe have something to eat and I check the news and then I go back to bed. And I did the morning of the 24th. Okay, everything cool. Went back to bed. Woke up a couple of hours later. I'm still an old man, so I wake up early, like 5:30 in the morning. Check the news again, and I was like, the hits there and there and there, and I was like, fuck. Sorry, bad. And then
No, 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 no. You can cuss on this show. It's fine.
and then Swedish radio calls me there, and they're like, "Oh, what's going on?" And before that, there was an air raid siren going off. And here you hear them well, but where we live, me and my wife, we hear them extremely well. And what do? I rush to the window and I open it, like what complete opposite to what you're supposed to do. And
Right.
then I go down to the store. I figured we have a mini market in the house. I figured I should pick up some groceries, when I can. There were more people there than usually, but no stress, nothing special. Traffic went on outside, and then it sank in during the day, I think, a little bit like, wow, what is going on? And then a couple of days later, of course, only a couple of days later, the attacks around Kyiv happened, and then we were locked in for, I think it was a Saturday at 5 o'clock until Monday, 8 o'clock. So 39 hours or something, somebody calculated. And then, of course, it really starts hitting you. And then we went out to shop on that Monday, and I think we stood in line for 2 hours or something. It was crazy. But people still didn't harvest the stores, though. There was
Yep.
no hamstring going on. But it started sinking in, and there were battles in Kyiv, and they cleared out the saboteurs. And obviously, I mean, the reason you get checked when you pass the checkpoints and the barricades is that obviously they're still looking for bad people out there. And now we are definitely living in war conditions. We're still not living in a war zone. here. There have been skirmishes, you could call it, but it's what's happening in Kyiv so far in the city is actually not, well, it's not good, of course, but it's on the level of armed robbers, shootouts like you would have in American cities every now and then. It's a little bit like the final scenes of what's it called now? It's a famous bank robber movie with Pacino and Robert De Niro when they have a big shootout at the end. That's sort of what we
Heat.
had.
Heat.
Yeah, Heat, exactly. When they,
My
when they
dad loves
exit the
that
bank.
movie.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
when there's the
yeah.
shootout there, that's sort of what's happening in Kyiv. Where the difference is the Russians had armored cars, not really heavy and anything like that. But we should
Hmm.
sort it out when it comes to Kyiv because um, most Ukrainian oblasts, which is sort of like a county in the United States, they are named after the major city in that county, which creates confusion sometimes. Because you talk about
Mm.
Kyiv, and there's a Kyiv Oblast or Kyiv County. And that goes for all of the counties. I think there's no county not named after the major capital, the major city. So the
Right.
fighting now is in Kyiv Oblast. It's outside the city limits of Kyiv. And there has
Yeah.
been fighting, brutal fighting in a lot of places. And the same also goes when you mention, for example, Kyiv or Sumy, then it's sometimes unclear whether it's in the oblast, Sumy Oblast, or in Sumy, the town. Um,
Hmm.
but so in Kyiv now, inside the city limits, no shelling and fighting limited to these paratroopers, no tank battles or anything like that. Kyiv Oblast, the county, major fighting, major shelling,
Right.
destruction of towns or suburbs. It's also important. Your audience is American, I assume.
No, really, it's mostly European. Probably half European, half American. And
Ah, all right, all right.
it's mostly people that follow me on Instagram. So calling it an audience might be a little generous, but no, definitely about a mix of half American. And when I say half European, even a lot of those European are people who live in Europe, but a lot of them are from South America. A few people that live in Africa. So pretty
All right.
diverse group, actually.
It's important, I think, when communicating with Americans to stress the difference in how cities look in Europe and in the United States, and then
Yeah.
specifically in Eastern Europe, the difference is very big. Because apart from a few big cities in the United States like San Francisco, Boston, Chicago, and New York that I've been to, um, many cities in the United States, they have a bunch of high rises in the center, and then there's an enormous suburbia stretching out with low houses, and people typically live in single houses, one floor, two floors,
Hmm.
and etc. In Ukraine, most cities are built in they are concrete block apartments, and people live in apartments. The whole suburbia phenomenon hasn't really started yet in Ukraine. Very limited. Uh, Basically, you leave Kyiv, and then you have villages outside. And then we talk real villages. I mean, they have chickens, and they have actually we still have that in places in Kyiv where the city has expanded into the villages. But uh, there's a very it's almost like a line, and you cross that line and you're in the countryside. There's no this suburbia in between. It doesn't really exist. And that's important to understand for the context of how
Yeah.
it looks. All of Kyiv, the Kyiv city, looks like downtown in a big American city. Buildings
Hmm.
are high, people live in apartment blocks, the cities have public transportation, everything is inside the metro system. You can walk to stores everywhere. You don't have to drive. You don't have to have a car to live in Kyiv, for example. You can go about your business as you want without a car. And then there are these few exceptions. We're starting to build suburbs where people live in satellite towns, and they started to make them nice. Irpin and Bucha, two such examples, which are located northwest of Kyiv. Now wiped out, both of them, pretty much. So there are these, but this is important to understand. This difference is how cities look, because when you're going to defend Kyiv, you're defending basically a place that have high buildings everywhere. All the way to the city borders, there are buildings up at 20, 25 stories. There are buildings, very few that are lower than 10. And there are massive concrete blocks in between. There are parks, and then there are, quite frequently abandoned factory complexes, leftovers from the Soviet Union time. Typically, there've been conflict about ownership and building rights, and they're still there, and they function very often as some kind of office hotel, but for car garages and for selling random items, and basically like the big shopping mall for hardware and leftover goods and things like that. And those complexes are, of course, they're beautiful to defend. And the city is also beautiful to defend. I mean, it's the defender's dream when you think about it. Very often, rather tight streets, and then some boulevards, of course. It's a defender's dream. And then, of course, the city is divided. The city center is located on what we call the right bank, because the river is going south. So that makes it the right bank. But to make it easy, we can call it the west side of Dnieper River. Downtown is located. And the river is massive. You don't build a pontoon bridge easily. You got that's like a week's job to put the bridge out there for tanks or vehicles or whatever. And so the Ukrainians can blow the bridges, which is, of course, extreme damage in terms of infrastructure. But
Right.
and there are no tunnels for cars. There is one tunnel, I think. I'm not even sure there is a tunnel for metro, maybe one. Anyway, and the left bank, then the eastern side of Dnieper, is mostly, like I would say 95% sleeping district, with apartment blocks, and most of them are after the Second World War, so they are like Soviet-style concrete slabs basically, and there are some new ones too. It's also a beautiful place to defend. So, and diameter, I checked the other day, it's like 40 kilometer, I think, across, typically from one side to the other. I think you take 40 kilometer, you can squeeze it either way you want. And the city is pretty circular and you take 40 kilometers, so the Russians have to advance then 20 kilometers in to reach the center. Give or take a few kilometers. But that's what they're looking at, block to block. And you can imagine what that's going to cost in terms of manpower and destruction. And say that they have half their army now devoted to Kyiv. And say that half of those, that's high though, say that half of those are combat troops, because a lot of guys are drivers and logistics and whatever. Half combat troops, I think it's less though. I think in the United States Armed Forces, it's like you count 10% being combat forces, but the Americans are the best with the logistics too, though. So it's lots of logistics. Russians, I don't think they have medical support even. So anyway, this going to cost them. So to say that then that my numbers are correct, that half of those are combat troops, then you have 50,000 men that are supposedly, and I think it's less. Say that it's 25,000. You should advance into this concrete jungle, which is now prepared, which has, I don't know how many, I have no idea, maybe 100,000, maybe more defenders, hiding in apartments, hiding around the street corners, having dug into the sewer system, factory complexes. I mean, you're looking at a nightmare, and Russians won't make it. They already suffered too many losses. They haven't managed to get inside Kyiv anywhere. And they are still bogged down outside Kyiv, making very little progress. Very unclear now, though. Everything is very unclear. The fog of war is total. And we don't know how open the supply lines are northwest, I think the Ukrainians control very much destroyed the supply lines. On the western side of the Kyiv Lake, which is that huge dam north of Kyiv, stretching up towards Pripyat and Chernobyl, I think that there's also a swampy ground there and a few rivers, smaller rivers going through. I think Ukraine has a lot of irregular, not say irregular, but like say light infantry operating there, ambushing the Russian supply lines. On the eastern side, I'm not sure. The Russians have supply lines going down from Chernihiv, Sumy, and I think I wouldn't be surprised if they even start involving the troops devoted to Kharkiv, that they will redirect them towards going north of Poltava and going down towards the Kyiv-Kharkiv highway and approach Kyiv from the east towards Borispol, still north of the Dnieper, or they might want to go south towards Cherkasy or Kaniv, most likely Kaniv, it's closer to Kyiv, and cross the Dnieper. But outside city, Kaniv is the next crossing point across the Dnieper, and I think that would be at least 50 kilometers south from the last bridge, the southern bridge in Kyiv. And then you have Cherkasy, which is probably another 50 kilometers at least. So there are a few crossing points there, but it's an enormous undertaking. I mean, as far as I understood, they had the idea to take Kyiv within 2 days, and that's obviously we're day 16 now, so that failed. And even if we don't know the whole thing, we do know that we have a lot of confirmed hits by the Ukrainian military on Russian armored columns, supply trains, and helicopters. We've seen those. And there are a lot of them. And those people who keep track of all this, there are some extreme nerds coming to prominence now. They're counting each confirmed hit from videos, and they're numbering in the hundreds now. Easily, Ukrainians took out more armored vehicles and tanks, I think twice even. We are up to 3 times as many as the whole Swedish armed forces have in total. I wouldn't be surprised if they're approaching US numbers on tanks soon. Who's got that many tanks? I mean, 300 destroyed already. I mean, it's ridiculous.
I want to kind of ask you about that because so from the outside perspective, right? It's that everybody, of course, was, and I think I was following it a little bit more closely than most people would because I'm pretty into geopolitics and this kind of stuff, so it's something that I'm already interested in. And I think that when Russia actually invaded, it was something that everybody was so shocked. You think it's Russia. They have a huge army. They do have tons of tanks. They have an air force. They have all this stuff. So a lot of people who are kind of uneducated about the situation, we look at that and then you would think, okay, if you're hearing Putin's plan is to take Kyiv in 2 days and he's kind of sending this much resources at it, everybody was obviously surprised that they just really didn't make any progress at all. And so then, of course, there's this point where you're hearing all the Ukrainian people say, yes, we're going to defend it. They're not going to be able to get through. But of course, Ukrainians would say that, right? Like you're a bit biased that that it doesn't, fall and that you are able to defend it. So people kind of want to not get your hopes up too much because the last thing you want to do is then you get your hopes up and you think, oh, wow, this is awesome. I love this story. And then, 2-3 more days later, it falls and it's terrible. And now we're on day 16. And, Kyiv doesn't look like it's going to fall anytime soon. I mean, it depends on who you listen to on TV. But like you said, the fighting in the outskirts seems to be, very fierce. But at the same time, you saw the kind of image. And I think, again, Putin did this for the propaganda. But this long convoy, everybody was talking about that of, all these trucks that Russia's sending in. And then now the news, I think, today is that convoy is mostly dispersed. They have the video of Russia's kind of trying to rush in a whole bunch of civilian trucks because, like you mentioned before, they're having such problems with logistics there. So it like you say, the central piece of the plan was to take Kyiv quickly and then kind of let all the other dominoes fall. That does not seem to be anything that's going to happen soon. they're resorting to more and more kind of, like they say, barbaric and terrible tactics in these other cities. Um, what do you think is kind of next if, let's say, Kyiv continues to hold out? Is it just that, is Russia just going to continue to try to sow mass like chaos and cause as much destruction as possible in other
Well,
places?
well, we have a lead, right? We have Kyiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, Mariupol, um, cities that all of them are holding. And if we're looking, and let's get back to those, but we're looking at the whole battle map. We go like clockwise. We have Kyiv, Kyiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, and then we have smaller places in Donbass that some are still holding. And I think Ukrainians even took Horlivka back, which is a half
I
big
heard
town
that.
outside Donetsk. And then you have Mariupol still standing, Berdyansk taken by Russians, Zaporozhye still standing, Dnipro, Russians are not even close yet, and they haven't made an attempt. But Zaporozhye is still standing, Kherson taken, and Mykolaiv holding. So basically, Russia's gain so far is Kherson and Berdyansk. And Ukraine obviously had weak defenses in the south. The priority was they had the army deployed already in Donbass, and they had priority on Kyiv, obviously. And so 16 days into the war, Russia hasn't even been able to take the soft targets. Sumy is not a very big place. Kyiv is even smaller, I think. And Mariupol is very close to both Russia's forces in Donbass, Russia itself, and the forces approaching from Crimea still standing. So what we can expect in Kyiv then would be similar situation. But Kyiv is massive. And if they haven't, and they're prioritizing Kyiv, they don't have enough troops for this. It's not going to happen. It's just a question, the sad question. Then I came to this conclusion because I was also, of course, not sure that Ukraine would do this well. I knew Ukraine would fight to all it had, but I didn't know it would do so well. And most of these
Yeah.
skirmishes or smaller battles in Kyiv suburbs, Ukrainians are actually winning. And I think Ukraine is almost on purpose pulling back when it's pulling back because they want to save their troops. And they're stinging Russia very often. So, well, Russia's going to hammer on, but how many troops do they have really? They went in with 200,000, and then we can cut a lot of them off, already killed, captured, wounded, taken back to Russia. And then we have logistics, support troops that are not combat units. And how many can they take? And I expect Russia to start hammering on Kyiv too, then with shelling, rocket artillery, all this. What are they called? The Grad, we call them here, but basically multiple launch systems, and basically destroy the city. But can they destroy such a big city? I don't think so. I think this campaign is screwed. My only big fear, and this gripped me after a couple of days when Ukraine started making success, how many innocent civilians are going to have to pay for this? How much destruction will it be before Russia understands this is a foregone cause? Yeah. What it's going to
That's
take for
the
them to give
problem, I
up?
think. Yeah, that's the problem for all of us now is that, well, mostly you guys, but the problem is that he really has nothing else left to lose, and it doesn't seem like anything that we do is going to kind of change his calculus here on how he factors all these things to happen. And basically what I want to, also get from you is I think, so there's a lot of people, already the gas prices in the US are at historic highs. Gas prices here in the Netherlands are also, historical highs. We've been, I've been seeing on your Twitter, you talk about I'm speaking of petrol basically. In the US, we call it gas, but then the natural gas here in Europe, that in mostly Germany, which comes from Russia, that's been kind of a contentious thing, reluctance to stop the imports of that gas. And I think that we live in a time where obviously everything gets political very fast, and we're also in a time where people don't trust the news. So everybody thinks that CNN and BBC and these different networks have their own agendas, and you kind of have this tendency now to tune out the noise and maybe not accept the realness of what they're saying on the news because of who's saying it. But I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation with you is because, you know, we're just normal people, right? Like we worked together in a marketing capacity before this whole thing happened. We don't have any kind of, you know, crazy biases or anything that we're trying to push. You're just a person who, you know, lives in Ukraine with your family, and you're seeing this destruction and, you know, evil, whatever you want to call it, that's happening to innocent people. I mean, I see Ukrainians now that have already made it here who are refugees, and mostly, you know, where people are familiar with Syrian refugees in the past 10 years that we've been talking about. But I just want to kind of make it real for people that when you are going to the gas pump and you're paying higher prices, or you're hearing about whether or not we should send troops and this kind of stuff, or send the weapons, like these are real humans, you know, that are suffering and that are just having their lives and their home, you know, ripped apart in front of their very eyes with nothing they can do about it.
No, it's true. I mean, Ukrainians, true, and it's there are some things I would like to add. Ukrainians will fight, of course, to the end to defend their homes, and they're already sacrificing their lives, and Russia will not succeed. And the only way to deal with this in Ukraine is to kick Russia out. They're not going to pull out, right? Putin is not going to pull out. He's got to be kicked out. And whatever he's talking about, negotiations and peace agreements, he's going to want Ukraine to enter some agreement that is complete
Yeah,
bullshit for Ukraine, or
it's all
will be
bullshit for sure.
yeah, or he will break the agreement whenever he can. So they forget about agreements with Russia. It never works. You got to kick them out,
Yes.
basically. Kick them out, or change the regime in Russia. And I think the regime change in Russia can only come from the Russian people. They can stand up. And now we see also tragically that it appears the only way we can get Russians to protest. There are some protesting, some people with ideals are protesting from the very beginning, but most Russians will not go out until uh, we make them poor. And sanctions. I mean, they rushed to IKEA when IKEA was about to close, and they rushed to McDonald's when McDonald's was about to close,
Yeah.
and now Instagram is going away for them. So
Yep.
I think sanctions play there. And also, to get back to your gas, petrol, and natural gas and such questions, this is not only about Ukraine. It's very nice. The Western world cares, humanitarian care, support for Ukraine, guns. But each and every tank that the Ukrainians take out is one tank less to worry about for NATO. Same with the aircraft the Ukrainians take out. And I'm sorry to say, the Russian soldiers too. And with regards to sanctions on energy and all the other sanctions, they are beneficial for the West as well, because they're dealing with the problem that the West has. So if Ukraine would capitulate, or Russia would occupy all of Ukraine, you have a massive cost for the West to deal with. You will have Russia crawling up very close to Central Europe and completely changing the security layout of Europe. And Russia would become a stronger power, and that will cost the West enormous amounts of resources to deal with. So the reality is, in my opinion, that sanctions and the cost for Mr. Smith and average Joe's wallet, they are easier to deal with a dollar on the gallon than they will be in taxes for paying for the extra military and all this trouble going on for a long time. So giving Russia a real fight now and sanction Russia, it's a good calculation to do that. It's going to be hard for a while, and for Westerners in pain, economic pain. In Ukraine, it's going to be harder, of course, because people will actually die. But the sooner we can get done with
Mhm.
this, the better. So we hit Russia as hard as we can. And my agenda is simple. We supply weapons to Ukraine as much as we can, and we sanction Russia as hard as possible. And I believe Western companies should be sanctioned. Cut everything with Russia. All the banks of Russia should be cut from any kind of international network. We should have energy sanctions, no more dealing with Russia. We should even have third country sanctions, I think. It's a tough one, though. But we should have sanctions on China if they support Russia. We should basically do all we can
Mm.
to strangle Russia, to get the population out, basically to make it impossible for Putin to finance his war. That's what it's about. If we hand business to Russia, we give them dollars and euros to fight the war, and it's wrong, and it's not in our interest. Ours, as I'm speaking about it as a Westerner now, but of course, obviously also as a Ukrainian.
Yeah.
The third front is information war. That one is done for Russia, though. We already won that one even before this offensive started. That third one is we're completely dominating that space. The Russian narrative is
What do you
dead in
mean?
the West. The information warfare, like
Oh,
in 2014, Russia managed to get a lot of its stories out to become mainstream. That Russian speakers are somehow pro-Russians. That Ukraine's government was half Nazi or whatever, and a lot of other stories. My family is speaking Russian. Most of the people, if not all people I've met in Kyiv over my 12 years here, are Russian speakers. None of them are pro-Russian. Just because you speak, it's like
right.
you speak English, you're American. What about King George III? Or George Washington? Which side were you on, right? I mean, George Washington spoke English.
Yeah.
He wasn't pro-English because of that, or pro-England.
Right.
So it's just ridiculous that a language you speak would make you loyal to a certain country rather than to certain freedoms that you have. And also with this Nazi stuff. Okay, so there are 2% of Ukrainians voted for extreme right parties in the last election. Let's compare that with any country in Europe, United States, or Canada, whatever. That's a very low number. The Ukrainian president is
Yeah.
Jewish, so hardly Nazi. The Prime Minister Groisman, that became Prime Minister shortly after the Euromaidan protests, is also Jewish. And that was the Nazi government that Russia. But Russia managed to get those narratives out, and they stuck with a lot of people. Still, you're a Russian speaker, you're pro-Russian. This is the kind of this refuses to go away, even though you can make such examples as, all Mexicans are then pro-Spain, whatever. Irish people are
Well,
supporting
it's also
England. It's weird. It doesn't
also
sit.
besides those narratives, the other narratives that he was able to get out there, I'll also admit that, I mean, I don't know if I would say I was a Putin sympathizer, but I did see that he had some points and some angles over the past, 10 years. So, for example, when he talked about NATO, he started this over 10 years ago where he would say that, so these anti-missile defense systems that NATO is, installing in all these countries, and he's, saying the U.S. is doing this, of course, that, well, all they have to do is a slight tweak, and then these anti-missile defense systems actually become pro-missile systems, aggressive, offensive missile systems that can then be aimed and shot at Russia. So he makes these kind of, comparisons, and he says, like, what if we went into Mexico and started putting, missile systems right next to the U.S.? They would never let us do this. So he was always kind of, painting this narrative of the, unfortunate Russia that's bullied by this, Western kind of world order, and that China also plays that same, card of we're bullied by America and by this country. And I think that the reason why that narrative has, willing listeners is because the U.S. does have a dark past of some things that we've done that we never admit to early enough, and we try to cover up, and we have all this stuff from the CIA and things like that. But ultimately, I mean, when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, okay, America's not perfect, but we are the good guys. NATO is the good guys. And I think that when you invade a country that's a democracy, that's your next door neighbor, and you bomb hospitals and you bomb residential buildings and you bomb orphanages, you lose that narrative to be able to say that you're the good guys in any possible way. You can try to claim, and then China, comes out yesterday and backs them up and says that the NATO is to blame for this invasion because of the pressure that they put on Putin. So in my opinion, what I hope from what you just said is that also that part of the narrative where Russia has claimed to be this oppressed nation also goes away, because unfortunately there will still be some people who give into that and will say, oh, but you basically forced Russia to, invade. Well, I'll tell you what, we put all these anti-missile defense systems everywhere because we're afraid that Russia will invade, and they just invaded a country. So I think it pretty much proves people right. But it's also embarrassing that the West, for so long, now all of these oligarchs, that they're confiscating their yachts, they're confiscating their London mansions, they're taking their Swiss bank accounts away. We've just let this happen for years and years and years and turned the other way. And it's now embarrassing, all of these actions that they're doing to sanction them, because it just shows you how much they've known about and they've put up with all these years enabling them.
Yeah, and I would like to say there about NATO that the comparison from Russia has been with the United States. That the United States has pushed then NATO borders closer to Russia. But how about Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, Finland? You know, the missile systems and tanks were pretty damn close to their capitals. As if, and in Putin's mind, it's like they are not, they are just pawns on the chessboard. And you know, what
Right.
about Europe then? We're all right next to this stuff. And well, what about Ukraine's security? And what about the fact that all these new members in NATO rushed for safety and rushed for cover? So, uh, you know, that whole story. And also, by the way, it was like in the NATO Russian Founding Act of 1997, there was no mentioning of not expanding NATO. So there wasn't even a promise made about that. And let's go to the American issues that, you know, bad things done by the United States. Okay, the most well-known and over-analyzed, etc., obviously the Vietnam War. All right. So what did President Johnson not do in 1968? He did not run for president, right? Because he felt like I am guilty of something here and I should not run for president again. Yeah, democracy. He absorbed responsibility and he chose not to run for office. So Mr. Nice Guy Nixon was elected on a no war agenda and increased the bombings, but that's a different story. Okay, so Nixon screwed up majorly, and with his re-election campaign, and what happened? He resigned. So there you have a huge difference to United States and to Russia. That these leaders, they were held accountable. Well, some we might have wanted to see more accountable, but they were at least to some extent held accountable. And
Right.
and that's a very big difference between a democracy and Russia. That we can hold our leaders accountable. And there were massive war protests in the United States in the late 60s and in Europe, across Europe. And there were massive, it's been massive debates, especially about the Iraq war in the United States. And well, if we're going to talk about blood and conquest and stuff, the United States is not even close to being a bad guy in this sense. United States is a, what should I say, the big new rich guy on the block. I mean, Sweden had blooded itself over and over again before the United States didn't even exist, right? I mean, we fought wars. We were like the war dog in Germany in the 1600s. There's a terrible atrocities committed by the Swedish armed forces in Germany in between 1630 and 1648, and then later. So Europe is a long story of blood. There's not a country in Europe that hasn't committed brutal atrocities, and they all have claims on land in other countries. Most of them, almost all. So you know, everybody's done mistakes and everybody's done things, and the difference is now that some are democracies and we try to correct things. And in this case, it's very black and white. Ukraine did not
Yeah.
do anything to deserve this attack by Russia. No provocations, no attacks, no sneaking in on Russia, no cyber games, no nothing. Ukraine is a complete innocent victim in this case. And I would say NATO is too. I would say even the United States is
Yeah.
completely free of guilt in this case. So this is a pure,
No, I
unprovoked aggression, raw, hard steel death from Russia.
I agree with you. I think it's just I think that maybe there's this delay from people who have kind of felt pro-Russian before, and now it takes a little time for them to kind of sink in, and they slowly maybe move, back towards the middle. And I'm generalizing because there's all kinds of different people with all kinds of different views. But like you said, I think NATO has gone into one country on a military operation like this on this kind of scale, and it was Afghanistan after 2001. NATO has never invaded another European country. There's no track record there of any kind of aggression or legitimate threat. Ukraine, while it has had its problems, of course, it's not corruption free. It's not perfect, just like no government is perfect. Ukraine is a democracy that is standing on its own. That it's a free market economy. It's a it's a place where people, just like every country in the world, they deserve to have their own country. They deserve to be sovereign. And it's something that for some reason, when Iraq invades Kuwait in the 90s, that's a big enough deal that the US has to go in and invade to kick them out. But this obviously is completely different because Russia's the one that's doing it, not Iraq. And I think that you have to draw a line in the sand sometimes and say, like you just said, Ukraine did nothing wrong. The desire to
No,
join the EU, there's nothing wrong with that. They want better lives for their people, The
yeah,
desire to join NATO, this shows you why they wanted to join NATO. They did
yeah,
nothing
yeah.
wrong. And so I think one of the things that's so admirable from so many, obviously you have, Zelensky asking pretty much every day for the no-fly zone or the extra planes and this kind of stuff. And very few people, I think, have actually been calling much for troop involvement. And I think it's obviously the best scenario for the world if Ukraine can fight Russia on its own. But like you said, the only end game that actually works out well for the Ukrainian people is you have to forcibly remove all of the Russians from Ukraine, or else it's
Yeah,
going to continue to be occupation and terrorism
yeah.
and kind of destruction there.
And the West have to break the back of Russia economically. That's just the way it have to be. Um,
Yeah,
that's the way to solve
it,
it.
it does seem like they're doing everything that they can. And just kind of speaking on that topic, I know you've posted a few different causes and a few different organizations that you've kind of been behind that people can donate to or support. Do you have any advice for people who are saying, like, I want to support Ukrainians, I want to do what I can to help?
Well, I mean, the thing that I started was I tried to get supplies to a local maternity clinic here, and I visited them the other day. That's why I took a ride through Kyiv, and I went down in the bunkers. I spoke with one of the department heads there, and she shared with me what they need, and I will now try to raise money for those needs. And that's what I'm doing. Anybody who wants to support me can find me on Twitter, and I will post about it there. I posted and I will repost. And the other thing that people can do, a lot of frustrated people out there, they can join the economic warfare against Russia or campaigns, push their politicians to take harder actions, join one of these groups that are forming all over the world now, or do it themselves to name and shame companies doing business in Russia. Um, of course, obviously, give money to humanitarian organizations. I'm sure we all have the ones that we know about, that we trust, and that either they're local or national that we know about. I'm sure they're all running Ukrainian campaigns now. I know a lot of folks in Eastern Europe in particular, but all over Europe are now taking care of Ukrainian refugees. However, I have to say, even the plight of the refugees is very sad, and all helping them is not part of the war effort. That's a humanitarian effort. And
Yep.
it's very hard for me to say that, but that's still a fact as far as I see it. Um, the war effort is economic, military on the ground, and the information sphere to win hearts and minds. The information warfare I consider to be completely dominated by the Ukraine and the West. The economic warfare is doing, the West is doing really well, but it's not slamming the door yet. There are many things left to do to get Western companies out of Russia and to stop buying oil and gas from Russia. Militarily, the West needs to provide Ukraine with all kinds of weapons that it possibly can. I think there are things going on that we're not aware of, for one. And I think that there are a lot of good efforts, especially the United States and the United Kingdom they've done a lot of good here. Other European countries are waking up. I hope for more weapons to Ukrainians so that they can defend. We had a problem, the more volunteers than weapons in Ukraine, and we need to arm them. And obviously, a lot of Ukrainians are learning firsthand how to be a soldier. If you're motivated and smart, you can of course learn soldiering fairly fast if the weapons you're going to use are not overly complicated, and many of the weapons provided are not overly complicated. I realized myself that the anti-tank weapons supplied by the British, I have training on this is a Swedish weapon, actually, partly Swedish. It's Swedish-British development, and I have training on that one actually. It's
Mm.
very easy to use. It's very easy to use. And also the Swedish anti-tank weapon, lighter one that's supplied, I also have training on that one, and it's even easier to use. I mean, it's really like you really put it up on your shoulder and flip, and you fire away. It's really easy to use. It weighs 10 kilos or something like that. Such weapons, of course, are perfect. And we see that warfare happening now where very cheap weapons take out very expensive weapons. The Stingers obviously working beautifully on any aircraft coming too low. And the javelins that the Americans are supplying are also working beautifully. And the economics of military, no, the economics of war is working in the favor of Ukraine. You have a Stinger. Well, I'm sure it's not cheap, maybe $50,000 for one. But the airplane is taken down. It's not $50,000. It's surely way more, right? So, and the same goes for the javelins. It's also like maybe $100,000. I don't know, or $50,000. But the tank is millions of dollars. So those are the economics of war.
Yeah.
But to support the boycott Russian companies, boycott Western companies doing business in Russia, share factual information about the war in Ukraine, and support Ukraine with military with arms. Those are the three things
How
that
are
I call
you?
for.
How are you? How are you verifying the information that you're seeing on Twitter? Because I think, like I said before, you're probably retweeting and sharing more news than anybody else I follow. And I just wondered, personally, like if you have tips, because there's so much information out there, and obviously a lot of it will be very positive news, on the Ukrainian side, and you want to believe it. How are you kind of verifying this stuff the best that you can?
Well, first of all, I've been in this game now for 8 years since Maidan. So a lot of the accounts that I share news from, I know. Some of them I know the people behind the accounts I know personally, and some of the accounts I've been in touch with these guys for 8 years. And obviously, I'm also sometimes sharing positive news without always saying that this is unconfirmed. I know that the Ukrainian government obviously have an interest in keeping morale up and sharing
Right.
positive news. We are not seeing numbers of Ukrainian soldiers dead, for example. That's not reported. Even though the defense minister of Ukraine this morning, I think it was this morning, he either slipped or he said it on purpose, but he said now there are more civilians dead than soldiers. He said Ukrainian civilians, Ukrainian soldiers, which would place the number of soldiers dead, Ukrainian soldiers dead, in the range of slightly below 2,000 then, I think, because I think the civilian deaths are going up at that level, which then Ukrainian side is thinking that the total number of Russian casualties are 12,000. Anyway, to answer your questions, it's a puzzle. You got to find yourself the sources that you do believe at least try to be accurate. And then you got to weigh information between those sources that you do believe are accurate. And if you have a source like the Ukrainian government, which has an interest in pumping up Russian casualties, obviously, and it's not always sure if they include captured soldiers in those 12,000 that they say today, well, then you have to give them a discount. You have to, maybe take down. So say that they are up at 12 today and they were 8 last week, so maybe it's 8 now. And then we don't know. Maybe the Ukrainians are wrong. Maybe they shot so many Russian soldiers to pieces without knowing it. Maybe the actual number is 15. And it appears Russians are not caring. They're not, taking care of the dead. But typically, in a situation like this, you have to pick good sources that are typically accurate, and then you still have to have validation among those sources. Yeah. You got to have an average of sources there. And you got to stay away from the drama queens, basically.
Right, right. Yeah, I didn't know that you had been, covering everything so closely for the past 8 years. So that's obviously
I haven't,
nice to just not
haven't been covering, but I've been following these accounts, a lot of them, since 2014. That's when I first got acquainted with them in person or online, and so they've been trustfully trying their best over time, which means that I trust them. They build trust in me. And the same I have done with others. I have stayed with this for a long time. So the problem is when the newcomers come in, and a lot of people come in new now, and it's easy to push the share button without knowing what information they share. So yeah, there it is. Like you have experience from who to trust. That's what I base my actions on.
Yeah. Please let me know if you need to go. I only have a couple more questions for you, but feel free to jump off if you I know your time is probably a bit crunched there.
Ah,
Um,
it's all right. We
do you
can
have
shoot
time
the
for a
last
couple more?
questions. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So basically, I have two left. One is in the I think very first couple of days there was the story where African and Indian students and people living in Ukraine faced racism at the border and they weren't able to get on trains and stuff. So that story kind of took on a bit of life. But then there's also been quite a few people recently that I've seen talking about Ukraine as a very inclusive place. Not a lot of discrimination there. Also, apparently they've said very female empowering, like a culture where women are actually very outspoken and independent. And I just wanted to ask you because you said you've been living there for so long. What is it like there culturally, as far as people of different ethnicities and different backgrounds, and also for women?
Well, let's start with women. Ukrainian women are traditionally very much like women were. You're back in the 50s in the United States, right? The woman is wearing heels and taking care of the house, and she's very pretty and she's always dressing up, and she's acting like really like a woman when you're out. All right. Fast forward and take away the hypocrisy. Even those women who are acting like that can be very strong at the same time, and they can dominate their husbands. Just because it looks like, not equality as we would say in the West, it doesn't mean that it is. She can be very influential.
Mm,
And now it's changing too anyway. So, for example, when I came here, it was hardly, you never saw a woman without heels outdoors. Now, actually, you don't see a woman with heels anymore. Things are changing. Just if
mm,
now wearing heels is a symbol of if it's related to feminism, etc. Then with the other question. I mean, to going into this ethnicity and racism, it's like it's a minefield wherever you say or do in there. I would say that Ukrainian society is a very homogeneous society. Most people here are
mm,
Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians. There's not a melting pot like that. I would say that personally, Ukrainians have a high tolerance, but they certainly use some words and language are used about, um, let's say, um, Africans that would be totally unacceptable in the United States. But from a Ukrainian point of view, it's just a description of who the person is. It doesn't mean necessarily that they have negative feelings towards that person. It doesn't mean that they're discriminated against. And I know some Black Americans who have known for years here. One guy, he told me, it's like, that's just words, he said. They're all nice to me, you know. They all respect me and they all care for
right.
me. So he sort of compartmentalized those things. Then as for the borders and stuff, well, I'm going to leave it with a statement. Some Eastern European countries refuse to take in Syrian refugees. And now Ukrainians are staying in hotels in those countries. I leave it there. I'm not going to go into any descriptive of, but we just look upon the reception and you draw your conclusions.
No, that makes sense. No, definitely. And then my last question is: so I assume that you experienced a COVID lockdown there in Kyiv when it first happened in the early 2020. Am I correct?
I wasn't here then, actually.
That were
I
you
was
in
in Spain.
Sweden?
I was in Spain.
Spain. They
Yeah,
had a pretty harsh lockdown there, right?
extremely hard. 7 weeks.
Yeah. So
Extremely hard.
my question was that it was kind of a common thing that people said of it's like going through World War II, and there were even some psychologists that came out and said that this might actually be worse than it was during World War II because now we have so much more that we lose, and we know how much is out there that we could be doing, and there's so much more to life now. And I think that that's a statement that as soon as I heard the first person say this is like World War II, I knew we were all going to regret anybody making that statement. And so now that you've been through a COVID lockdown in Spain, now you're in an actual, like you said, not exactly war zone because the war zone's a little bit away from you, but you have the airstrikes going on. It is dangerous to leave your house. There are people's apartment buildings who get, bombed and shelled. What can you compare the two situations? And I'm not saying that they should get a false equivalency, but can you compare the two situations of, being under a strict lockdown because of COVID in Spain, and then now, being under the type of military lockdown that you are in Kyiv?
First of all, I was never a big fan of lockdowns. I agreed with the Swedish version there. I thought the lockdown in Spain was in many ways not very clever. Because, for example, we got stuck there because of the COVID thing. We had a flight back to Ukraine and it was canceled. But I mean, we lived in a neighborhood where we can have long walks without even getting close to anybody else, and still we were not allowed to get out. It was more like a blanket order there, and it was frustrating actually. And because you'll also face those brutal fines here. To be honest, I'm not facing any fine if I go out or anything, except for 8 o'clock in the evening to 8 o'clock in the morning. We got those 12 hours, right? Night curfew. But anyway, it's different now. It's really this is hardcore. I mean, this is hardcore. It's a totally different level, and you're actually facing mortal danger. You wouldn't face mortal danger in Spain or Sweden or United States or wherever if you took a walk in the local forest alone. You wouldn't face any mortal, but here you do. You can get a missile in your head anytime. So it's a very big difference. As for Ukrainians in my family, for example, they're like, oh, my mother-in-law, but my mother, she was a slave worker in Austria during the Second World War. And my father, my mother-in-law says too, my father, he was shot to pieces almost by grenades when he was a truck driver during the war. They had to dig him up through the rubble, and he had some, I don't know, small damage and obviously mental damage for the rest of his life. Even though he was a nice guy, there were some issues at night and whatever. They compare with that. So they're saying like, no, it's not like World War II. And my wife is saying, keep your head up. And she was like, you shave yourself and you dress nicely and we don't lose control. We are calm and we get through this. She's been very strong, I have to say. And she's not pushing. She's been very, very good. And we talk about a woman, sometimes she really wants my help to go down to the local store because she don't want to go alone. I think that's more like she wants company. But now when faced with this, she is rising big time. And nobody's caving in here. Nobody's crying in my family. So we're all, and I feel I'm not afraid. I'm frustrated. I'm sometimes feeling this hit in my belly that shit, what is going on? But I'm not afraid as such. I'm worried maybe in the mornings I wake up. I need to understand what's going on. I need to know what happened during the night. First thing. I panically try to find my sources and see what happened. If there's anything I need to know, and I sleep bad, but whatever. Sleep 5 hours instead of 7. Is that a big sacrifice? Not really.
Yeah,
I don't take my daily long walks. Such a big sacrifice.
Yeah, it's better than sleeping in those underground bunkers and things like, so many people are. So
Yeah.
And what you just said, it's fascinating. I've seen so many people, and obviously the news is going to try to show you the more uplifting stories, but I've seen so many people who they just have this kind of resolve where they say, I saw one girl earlier in one of those student towns that got shelled, and she said, I just thought to myself, okay, I'm ready to die. Like, this is going to be it. She said, I didn't cry. I wasn't, I didn't, freak out or anything. It was just like this, calm feeling that happened. And there are so many people, dealing with something that you would just think is unthinkable, even a month ago. And everybody just responded in such a positive way. Well, thank you so much, Anders, for doing this episode of the podcast. And I really appreciate you, just telling people what you're going through and taking this time.
Thank you, Lucas. My pleasure.